Okay, this morning I am going to get a chance to talk to somebody who I know more out of reputation and interaction with his work than I do from talking to him personally, but I'm really happy to be talking to him personally today. His name is Garth Paine, and he is a crazy multimedia musician, and it's funny. I went over on his website, and I make it my job to know what all the instruments and all the software is, and he lists his primary instruments, and I didn't even know half of them. So that just tells you where it lies for me. He's on the edge, and I love the edge. And so I'm really looking forward to the chance to talk to Garth. Hey, Garth, how are you doing today?
Hey, Darwin. Great. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
No worries. So you currently are camping out in Europe, working at IRCAM, if I remember right, correct?
Right. Yep. Sitting at IRCAM right now, talking to you.
What are you doing over there?
I got this amazing research residency this year between IRCAM and ZKM for the whole year. The initial proposal was this piece called Future Perfect, which is a piece for high order ambisonics, playback in a dome, as it were, cell phone playback and virtual reality. And so it's kind of proposed as a piece that plays between field recordings and the kind of surreal spaces that one might compose, and is constantly kind of like you're never quite sure whether you're actually somewhere real or not somewhere real.
Yeah.
So we've been working on that across the whole year, and at IRCAM we've extended the amazing cell phone music systems they've been building here for a bit to do spatialization across all of the cell phones in the audience. So a whole layer of the piece happens actually on your cell phone in the web browser, and so I can and do send sounds to everybody and then spatialize them across the whole audience, which is just amazing because it brings the sound like from this beautiful sound sphere out in the speakers, which is gorgeous, but it brings it like right to you in a really fantastic way.
So I'm not sure I'm completely understanding. You're saying are you grabbing audio from the cell phones, or are you sending it to the cell phones?
Sending it to them.
Okay, and then each individual listener gets sort of their own personal spatialization or something?
Right. So imagine that you're playing. So the main score is going out over, higher order ambisonic speaker dome.
Mm-hmm.
And then composed along with that are layers of other sounds and some sounds that you're hearing in the dome that are then sent out to the cell phones.
Oh, okay.
And then I can trigger those sounds to play on the cell phones, or I can actually, on the iPad, which is what I'm doing most of the time, draw vectors of spatialization, which is basically like vector-based amplitude panning. And so those sounds that are on the phones are then being essentially the amplitude of them controlled to get spatial audio across all of the cell phones in the audience.
Oh, for Pete's sake, that's amazing. And then do you do any kind of compensation for latency from different phones, or is that just part of the nature of playing around with that?
Right. And there you hit the nail on the head, which is, of course, that there are all kinds of challenges. Some phones are louder than others, and the latency actually, so all the phones are locked onto a central clock.
Okay.
So all the samples that I'm sending out to the phones are playing synchronously. So actually the latency is not a problem, and the spatialization gestures can be really fast. So yeah, that's not a problem, but of course the timbral variation between phones is like a challenge. and it took me a few months to really work out what works on the phone speaker.
Yeah, I can imagine. And it just like saying, well, here's a sound that'll work on 4mm speakers, but it won't really work on 3mm speakers, I can't even imagine that kind of composition. That sounds crazy.
Yeah, it is a bit crazy, but it's really amazing when you get I've done it with 300 phones so far.
Oh, wow.
And when you get 300 people in the audience, you get this just shimmering texture that's right through the space and coming out of the dome at the same time. It's an extraordinary effect.
That's got to be fantastic. That really sounds interesting.
Yeah, it's fabulous.
Yeah. And so that's what you're up to. I get it now. Well, it's interesting too that you've been working with ambisonic and kind of massively surround sound for a while. I know you helped us out at Cycling by getting us some multi-channel material for us to use with the new MC release. I really appreciate you helping us out with that.
Yeah, no problem.
But you've been kind of working on like ambisonic field recordings, capturing those, as well as not only capturing but then also producing the output. What, from your standpoint, what do you think is going to be the greatest end result? Do you think it's going to be like what you're doing now, where live performance is the place that occupies? Because it's sort of hard to imagine that stuff really becoming like a living room experience,
Yeah, that's a $600 million question right there, isn't it?
Right.
I mean, it depends because, I was just looking at something the other day that was talking about virtual reality headset sales. And with the new standalone headsets coming out, the sales are just like taking off like crazy. And so I forget what that was, but it was, I think it was billions of headsets basically.
Oh, really?
And so the impact, the kind of take up is being projected at the moment, at least, to be equivalent to the cell phone take up. And really interesting to me is that that's being proposed with standalone headsets rather than, apps on the phone and the current kind of systems that we've had, like Gear VR and stuff.
Right.
Because personally, I don't really want another piece of technology when I have a really powerful computer sitting in my pocket.
Right.
So the scope, obviously, for ambisonic use there is huge. And whether or not I actually see I think it's like an incredible time. I keep saying to my students, like, you're just living in this incredible time of this revitalization of the audio industry, with this real excitement about spatial audio finally having a reason to be, in terms of the industry. And of course, what that does is it just opens up this creative space, which is like, as you're asking, well, what does that mean in terms of creative practice? What are you going to do with that? And I think that's an incredibly rich area, which we haven't really, the playback in the dome is like fantastic, and I've had the great luxury of doing some stuff at MPAC and playing with both high order ambisonics and wave field systems at the same time.
Right.
And this is kind of what I was hoping to do in this residency, actually, because the wave field allows you, again, to bring the sound right up to the individual. And I've seen some amazing concerts, using wave field, like a Jonathan Harvey piece for trombone, where the trombonist plays one part and then moves down the stage and plays the next part and so on. Mm-hmm. And they'd use the wave field to just reproduce the previous part exactly where he was standing. And so you end up with like 8 trombonists across the stage playing that Jonathan Harvey piece. And then, of course, he walks off because he's like, okay, I'm done now. So these kinds of ways of thinking about what does it mean to put a sonic object in space, and how does that change your performance approach? And, of course, what does that mean in terms of live performance and gestural performance? And I don't know. I mean, I think that's kind of what fires me up for this project this year, between IRCAM and ZKM, is both that thinking about spatial audio as this performative creative space, and also thinking about what is VR as a performative creative space. Like, we've kind of used it for documentation and we've used it for games, and those things are really interesting, but they're not the kind of art creative live space. And I think there's a huge potential for both of those things to happen in the VR space. And actually, the thing that I should say is that when I started this project, I wasn't expecting to be playing with cell phones at all. I mean, I was writing Unity apps and, looking at that. And then, there's obviously lots of problems with that because Apple and Google and so on want to somehow make judgments about your app in terms of whether it can be distributed or not. And that kind of bothers me as a creative process, that somehow you have to get these overpowered institutions to approve your work before it can be shared. And then I started looking at web VR, which is, again, just delivering the whole VR experience through the browser. And then because they've been doing this work in web audio here at IRCAM for a few years, started, I don't know now, probably 3 or 4 years ago with Norbert Schnell. And then I started thinking, wait, maybe we could actually deliver this whole thing through the browser. And that's kind of interesting to me because it just goes directly to the audience rather than having to, go through all these approval channels. And then I started thinking, well, okay, so maybe the cell phone, if I have hundreds of them spread across the space, maybe that is a better way to go than using Wavefield, which of course is insanely expensive and only a few people have. And so actually I've been thinking a lot this year about how we democratize access to these things and how we engage the audience directly rather than having to layer all of these things that are really associated with consumption and marketing and so on and really have nothing to do with the artwork.
Well, I think that's really important, though, because if you take a look at the really big players in technology, you have Apple and Google that have the app stores locked down.
Right.
You have Google and Amazon that have voice control locked down. You have Apple and Microsoft that have the desktop and, the desktop lockdown.
Right.
It's really a very small number of gatekeepers that control all of this stuff. And the web ends up being that one democratizing factor because nobody, Microsoft, as hard as they tried, they couldn't make a proprietary version of it.
No, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and actually that's, so, one of the things that's I'm getting actually really excited about with the cell phones is that, pretty much everybody has a cell phone that's capable of HTML5 and you can therefore, send content into their browser in real time. And so that opens up the idea that you could actually just do guerrilla concerts anywhere, like anywhere that I could get a power outlet to plug a router into, I could do a concert. And so you could actually, I've been thinking this year about, well, what if I did kind of like flash mob concerts where it was basically like just rock up and bring your phone. And then it kind of starts breaking down the whole hierarchy of the concert hall and, the infrastructure that we all use all the time for electronic music, the big PA and all these kind of questions of power and authority that comes from those kinds of technologies. And it kind of, again, thinking about breaking that down and just bringing it back to just my relationship with the audience directly. And in this case, everybody brings their own instrument, which would be just their cell phone. And I'm kind of like, when this project's over, I'm thinking next year that I just want to really dig into making a whole bunch of pieces that are, 5 to 10 minute long pieces that I could just do really simply with just a router plugged in and off we go,
Right. That sounds really interesting. Well, Garth, one of the things that I like doing in my podcast is I like talking to people about their background. And I mean, we've just started talking about your work with ambisonics and massively specialized sound, but you do a lot of other stuff. I mentioned when I joked about you using instruments I've never heard of, I'm specifically talking, and when I looked on your site and it talked about the Karlax, I'm like, what the hell is a Karlax, right?
Oh, yeah, that's the beast.
Yeah, indeed. But, you also kind of have sort of a political view behind your composition and music making as well. Not necessarily a Democrats or Republicans or Labor Party kind of a politics, but more the essential politics of the economics of humanity or something, right? The politics
Right.
of humanity. And what I'm curious about is, what is your background, and what is the part of your background that makes that important to you?
Yes, that's very nicely put. And it's true. So sometimes people, I teach at ASU, Arizona State University, and I'm 2/3 in the School of Arts, Media and Engineering, which is like a little kind of hothouse cross-disciplinary school, and a third in the music school in the composition faculty there. And often people in the music school and others say to me, I don't understand what you do. Like, what are you doing?
That's always a good sign, man.
Right. That's right. Something obviously new, I guess. But actually, so what my answer is that actually all of my work deals with sound as material. And I like to think about the materiality of sound, like, that it has density and texture and mass and surface and viscosity and so on and so forth. And so whenever I'm composing, performing, I'm really thinking about sound as this really thick, fluid material that I'm kind of sculpting in real time, or if I'm composing, in the work itself. And for me, that's also, I guess, how I relate to the world. So I also co-direct the Acoustic Ecology Lab at ASU with Sabina Feist. Coming back to the kind of politics of it, that's a project that's been teaching listening workshops and engaging volunteers to make field recordings in the national parks across the southwest of the US every month for us, which is a way of engaging people through listening and sound in contemplating climate impact and thinking about their role in it, and actually having a role in, analysing and making, larger contributions to trying to work out what we can do about that. And all of that stuff, which is the kind of action stuff, if you like, comes for me out of growing up in Australia, where you can really feel this dynamic energy just coming out of the earth there. And I grew up actually in Tasmania, which is a beautiful island off the south of Australia. And it's really pristine. And even as a kid, I like to just kind of go out places and just lie on the ground at night and just listen and just kind of be present there. And I used to do a lot of sailing, so my father would take me to the beach with my dinghy in the morning, and sailing dinghy, and pick me up at night, and I would basically just head out to sea. Mm-hmm. And then the next place from Tasmania is New Zealand, so it's like that's a week sailing in a big boat. And so I just grew up having this sense of space and this vast, like this being a point in this really huge, large dimensional thing that is the world, that is the environment we live in, and the people that are in it, and so on. And I've always loved just being kind of in that. And I still often go out, like I still make sound field recordings in Joshua Tree National Park as part of this project, and other places every 6 to 8 weeks. And I still like getting out there at like 4 a.m. or so and sitting up, and I still lie on the ground and just record and listen for like 2 or 3 hours at a time. It's really, for me, it's really transformative, because what happens after a while is your body kind of just disappears and you just become a kind of floating awareness in the sound field. And I've kind of called this somophony, meaning soma as in subtle body and phony as in sound, as a kind of idea that we listen with our whole body rather than, with our mind. And so those things, if I'm trying to weave all those things together for you, but all of those things are related to a sense of just trying to be present. And I still ask myself, like, a lot, what does it mean to be really, truly present? Mm-hmm. And so all of that comes through in my music as well, because I really want people to feel that the music is really very present with them right there. and that they're going on a journey of some kind. So there's always a kind of sense of space and a sense of being present together rather than separate, if you see what I mean, as an individual.
Sure.
In the performance work that I try to make. And I think that, sorry, that's really long-winded, but I think that kind of underlines everything I do in terms of this sense of thinking about being present, and the kind of comment that you made, which was a very lovely comment about this kind of sense of humanity, and therefore for me why it's important that my art practice should also include building agency and stewardship in communities around climate change through listening and sound. Right. Because I think listening is just like the most powerful thing we can do, and we all do it. But if you go out and you just teach like active, passive, and directed listening modes to people, and they're like, "Oh my God, it's like the world is completely different now," and it's like, no, the world is the same as it was, and this right. is what you were doing before. It's just now you have a term, and you can say, "I'm now doing this kind of listening," and it just makes it a conscious practice rather than a subconscious one.
Well, it's interesting the way you're talking about this. I am currently, Tom Whitwell turned me on to a book called Where the Heart Beats, John Cage, Zen Buddhism, and the Inner Life of Artists, right?
Right.
And where it kind of weaves John Cage's journey and sort of the simultaneous journey of Zen Buddhism coming into America, and how how he was influenced by this Buddhist thought, and a lot of it seems to resonate with what you're talking about too, which makes me wonder: is there sort of like a spiritual part to what you do, or do you try and keep that at arm's length?
So, yes, I have an interest in Tibetan Buddhism. I have practiced it actively in the past. I'm not so much these days, but it's part of my life.
Right. Okay.
But actually, it's not that it's, my other answer to you would be no, in the sense that, like, that doesn't drive what I do, and it doesn't really inform the practice as it is, because in a sense, what I've learned in Tibetan Buddhism affirms the things I was already feeling and doing. And so my sense that you may have noticed on my website that, I have this little phrase at the top, it's all an n-dimensional vector field.
Yes.
and I love the weird looks I get from people when I say that. But that's how I perceive the world. I mean, I just feel that everything is this incredibly complex manifold of relationships. And so, Buddhism talks about that in really beautiful ways. And so it's a bit like the listening that I was just talking about. We all do it, but then if we learn some terminology for it, then we can talk about it in a more succinct way, I guess.
Sure.
But yeah, for me, I guess that's true. A lot of my music has a kind of, it does have a kind of more spiritual essence to it, but it's not like I'm trying to go crystals and beads and let's all hang out kind of thing. I mean, it's just that I feel sound is also this extraordinary energy, and so if we're composing and working with and being inside this energy, then that's already for me an extraordinary and kind of spiritual experience.
Sure.
It doesn't matter whether it's Merzbow or whoever. It doesn't matter whether it's noise and grit or it's, a single sine tone. It's still extraurordinary experience.
Yeah, I hear that.
Yeah.
Just a little side note here. Introducing to yourself as it's all an n-dimensional vector space might be fun and funny, but it's going to make your mom sad. What you have to do is you have to still maintain that job as a professor in a college, because then your mom has something to latch on to too, right?
Yeah, well.
There you go.
I have to tell you that for many decades when I've shared work with them, they've all gone, oh, that's nice, son, but it's way over our heads. So, or they like to say, well, that was nice, but it's not really music, is it?
Excellent, yeah. So now I want to talk a little bit about the breadth of the work that you do. Because if we go to your site, the activatedspace.com site, we get an opportunity to see that you work on installations, you work on music, and in the music area, you do electroacoustic work, you do field recordings, you do some purely electronic work, you work with dancers. I want to thank you especially for having a section of the site that has some of your scores. I think that we don't share scores enough with people.
Yeah, right.
And I think that that's actually a really powerful thing to share with students and stuff.
Yeah.
But in any case, you have staked the amount of ground that you staked for yourself is pretty broad, which on one hand, that can be exciting and kind of liberating. You know, if you get tired of one thing, you're free to do another, right? On the other hand, it makes it kind of difficult for people to define you and your musical thing.
Right.
What do you do to combat that problem, that second problem?
I don't.
Okay. End of questions.
Right. No, this is one of my failings, you might say. So yeah, you're totally right, and like I often feel like I would like works that I've made to have more showing or more outings than. But you're right. You know, a lot of people are like, oh, but this isn't really what you do or whatever, and it might be like, well, yeah, I do actually do that, and that's what this piece is about. But because I also do a wide range of other stuff, like, you know, people that run festivals and curate stuff are often like confused about, well,
right.
I don't know how this fits in here. So yeah, you're very astute at hitting right on the nail here once again. And so I don't know how to change that, because that's why I always say to people, well, my whole practice is about sound as material. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't matter whether I'm, sticking biosensors on dancers and making interactive dance works, or whether I'm, composing with field recordings or making, I made a set of robots a few years ago that played Tibetan singing bowls. And I do gigs with those and a bunch of resonating orchestral cymbals that I've composed ways of controlling and performing basically from an instrument. So I can have all the cymbals around the room and have all the resonant frequencies up on the instrument and then kind of play between those. And yeah, so I actually personally feel that it's more a problem. And this doesn't help me, of course, but I think it's more a problem of the industry, if you like, or of the institutions, which is that we have to say, oh, great, you do drum and bass, and this is a drum and bass festival, and it's like, okay, cool, well, that's great, and so we tend to define things through genre rather than through a kind of where the focus of inquiry is, right. And I think it's much more interesting to think about the focus of inquiry, which could allow us to express things in different ways, and I often give lectures in the music school looking at, and I ask questions about, what is music basically, and trying to look at electronic music. And then I start off with a bunch of pieces of music and ask them what defines music. And we slowly go through this list and ask them, is this music? And of course they say harmony, counterpoint, and melody, right? And so then we get down, basically we end up with, a piece by Merzbau and a piece by Ligeti. And, and the students are like, no, neither of those are music because we can't hear harmony, counterpoint, or melody in them. Right. And then in the end, they're like, maybe the Ligeti's music because I think we can kind of hear that there are instruments there. Uh-huh. And that just blows my mind, because it's like, not only, of course, the ignorance in terms of thinking about, or the innocence or whatever that is in terms of thinking about what is music, but the fact that we would really separate these things out as completely different kinds of practices that would never be put in a festival together, right?
Right, right.
Whereas, of course, sound clusters and textures on an orchestra are really extraordinary, and so is the incredible fine, nuanced skill of Merzbow playing, a really big noise set. And these are really, in my view, talking about the same thing, talking about the richness of texture and timbre and the density of sound and the kind of surface that you can generate. And if you haven't actually been in a Merzbow gig, you don't understand that incredibly small detail that he's varying on the surface texture of that sound. And then you go and listen to, let's say Ligeti, and you get the same incredible detail to the textural surface. And so I kind of think that the problem is that we do tend to just kind of classify things through genres or various things, and we don't think enough about these kind of freer questions about what is it that we're trying to explore here, because that would really make some cool festivals, in my view. And you'd go along and get really wide range of material that was all essentially addressing similar questions.
Yeah, I agree. Although I wonder if some of that isn't bowing to the reality of how humans make decisions about where they're going to go, right?
Right.
I think that you see this in many different ways, but the idea of having no constraints tends to be really frightening for people. Right. Or really confusing for people. And it's the more you put constraints on, the easier it seems to be to help people to make a decision. So when it comes to like doing a festival, if I say I'm going to have a festival of music, everyone's like, well, I don't know what that could mean. And, the people that are into Merzbow are going to be like, that might be country music. And the country music people will be like, that might be that kooky stuff that the pointy head people play. Right.
Right.
But, then if I say it's experimental music, well, a bunch of people know, well, now I don't have to bother. Right.
Right.
But the remaining people are like, well, what if that's Merzbow? Or what if that's Aphex Twin? Or what if that is, the guy who takes a snare drum and bangs it on a table, right? Which of these might that be, And so I think there's this problem that festival creators have, which is how do we provide the constraints that allow people to make the decision to show up too? And it's frustrating as a person, and I consider myself having this as well, a person who has a broad range of interests and who would like to be influenced by a broader range of influences. It's difficult when you feel like you have to pick them off like individual grapes off the vine, right? You can't go and get like the flood of it because there just doesn't seem to be venues that allow for that.
Yeah, which I just think makes everybody's experience poorer, to be honest. I totally get what you're saying, and I know that I tend to be seen as eccentric by a lot of people because, everybody you just mentioned I listen to, right? Mm-hmm. But it's, I don't know. So perhaps I can give you a little example, of trying to do something about this, because every year we run, and it just finished yesterday, at ASU, myself and a couple of colleagues run a little 3-day festival called Prisms Music Festival. And in the past they've done, a festival on Stockhausen, one on Xenakis, one on Cage, one on microtonality, etc. And then a couple of years ago, I got involved and I said, why don't we think along the lines that we've just been talking about? So we made one called Noise Spectra. And of course, that opens it up to all kinds of orchestral repertoire and contemporary composition of all kinds. But then we invited John Richards to come out from the UK, who, was the inventor of the Dirty Electronics movement, and run a workshop and do a Dirty Electronics concert. And then last year we had a theme Out of Time. And again, that brings up all kinds of ensemble and acoustic instrument pieces and so on. And then we invited Carl Scaletti to come and give a Kima workshop and do a concert around notions of time and so on. So, and this year it's outer space. And so thinking about themes that allow us to think about work that can be collected around these broad themes that all express a central, kind of point of inquiry.
Right.
And then for me, that helps tell the audience, hey, you're going to experience a whole bunch of stuff about, outer space, and it's all sound and music. And so then you can have installations and you can have the orchestra doing some stuff and, so on. But it doesn't limit it in the way that it doesn't limit it to genre or to a specific time period or a style or something. So that's kind of, my own little tiny contribution to trying to change that idea.
Sure, but that makes sense. And if you think about something like art gallery exhibitions or art museum exhibitions, right?
Yeah.
One good exhibition might be, hey, here are all of the Van Goghs that we can get together. So you're going to see the expression of an artist. Another might be, oh, here's expressionist paintings, that focus on the color blue or whatever.
Yep.
And at least what that does is that gives you a thing. If it's sort of like we have art that doesn't have a tendency to help people, that doesn't prepare them for when they walk in the door, what they're going to experience. And I think that preparation, that mental preparation, even if it's simple, can actually help people have a better experience.
Yeah, I think so. And actually, I think the art world does this way better than the music world. So when I set up the Sonic Residues Festival in Australia, I ran it at the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art. Mm-hmm. And that was intentional not to put it in a music venue because I wanted people, and it was all acousmatic and electroacoustic music, and I wanted people to come and listen. And I didn't want them to come and listen for a specific thing, right? I just wanted them to come and experience sound as a medium, as a composed material in that sense.
Right.
And if you look at the art world, I just went to the Palais de Tokyo here the other day to see Thomas Saraceno's show, which is amazing. And the first room is about 50 kind of wire frames in which he's put spiders that have weaved webs, and then he's put different kinds of spiders in there. So you've got these kind of hybrid web environments that are all woven by spiders, which are just mind-blowing. And that's art, okay? And it's amazing. But the kind of flexibility with which galleries and art curators think about what the content is, I think is really interesting. And it gives the artist a freedom that we really struggle with in the music industry, where these terms and these genre definitions are so tight, and they become the rationale for putting a bunch of work together. And I guess what I'm arguing is I just don't think that's a really great way to keep going about it.
Right.
Yeah.
I feel like we're running out of time way before I get a chance to ask you all the stuff I'd like to ask you just based on our conversation. So if you don't mind, I'm going to take kind of a jump leap here because I want to ask you a little bit about your music performance work. First of all, do you ever work in collaboration or in groups or anything like that, or do you always work solo?
Yeah, I've done a lot of collaborative work, all of the interactive dance stuff is obviously collaborative.
Right.
I have an ensemble now called, actually I have two bands. One's called B1 and the other's called B2.
Okay, put a lot of thought into that one, huh?
Right. So B2 actually does quite a bit of stuff with a friend of mine, Simona Moncuso, and he's a percussionist. So we actually combine lots of forces from, live processing using Kima to the singing bowl robots and resonant cymbals and things, and then percussion. And actually I even throw the modular into that setup. And then B1 is much more a kind of dynamic collection, which is collaborative pieces that I write with live electronic processing, for instance, for usually for some kind of acoustic instrument. So yeah, and then as you point out, I do a lot of solo stuff, which is, I guess, the avenue through which I'm kind of testing out ideas and exploring things. Sure. And it's the space, I guess, in which I can really, because I've done a lot of work in the NIME community space, and was kind of been part of that community for a long time. And so I've really, I guess, done a lot of thinking or experimenting with what is an interface and what is interaction. And for me, these are really big questions that are still really big open questions in terms of electronic music performance. How do you perform it, and how do you get rich enough real-time transformation of the sound world to be satisfying as a composer and a performer in real time?
Yeah, well, I think you're kind of zeroing in on sort of like where my question was leading to. One of the things I'll notice is that when I look at all your work, you talk about the materiality of music and of sound that you work with, and it's clear that's the way you view it, but also there's a kind of a sub part of that, which is that you do a lot of things with physical instruments, right? Whether it's an instrument, whether it's the
Karlax.
The Karlax, yes, whatever the hell that is, right? But you have a lot of physicality. You take a look at your installations; it's chock full of like physical devices and stuff like that, right? You have an attachment in a way of sort of like physicality. But one of the problems is if you're doing a band, you can't show up with a different instrument every time you play in the band, right? Or if you do...
Well, you kind of can.
I guess you can, right? I guess it depends what kind of band it is, right?
Right.
But, I mean, if you're doing Steely Dan covers, no, you're not gonna.
Right.
But still, I think one of the things that makes up a band, if you put quote marks around it, is that everyone has sort of a role to play within that collective, right? My question is, how do you allow yourself flexibility in the physical expression of how you play an instrument when you're also working in collaboration and so many different kinds of collaboration? How does that work for you? How do you manage that kind of complexity?
It's something I really love because, I mean, what the computer does really well is that it takes something that's concrete, like the sound of a drum or, whatever. I play the flute also, so let's say the flute, or I wrote a piece for cello last year in live electronics, and it takes this sound that's actually really concrete, that has this fixed morphology that we all know, and it immediately allows it to be fluid and flexible and transformative. Rather than thinking about my role in these ensembles as the person that plays X, I think about my role as the person that takes the concrete things and makes them fluid, and then can transform the kind of sonic texture and the sonic world of the ensemble through being able to do that. And of course, then that becomes an improvisation, a collaboration where those transformations are going to lead us to go in different places. So even when I write scores, they're not necessarily fixed set of, that they're not temporally fixed necessarily. And I like to, if I've written a piece for somebody who I haven't played with before, I like to say to them, look, there are three of us here, really. There's like you, and there's me doing the controlling, and then there's the algorithms, and they're going to do a bunch of stuff, and that's going to surprise me sometimes. And, there we are. We're in this dynamic relationship. And sometimes, like there's a piece that I wrote for bass drum, snare drum, and live electronic processing. And the length of the processing that occurs out of some of the attacks is variable based on a bunch of things. And when I gave that piece and to the performer, in that case it's live electronics, but I don't play, and I just had to keep saying no, wait, just listen for what's happening in the electronic part and just wait, and when the time is right you'll know when it's right, but don't just like go, okay, bar one, bar two, bar three, got to play this stuff, because otherwise you're just kind of steamrolling over what the possibilities are. And so I guess that comes back to, the discussions we're having about n-dimensional vector fields and so on, is that I kind of embed that in my practice, thinking about these things they're always dynamic. And so the performance from one day to the next is always going to be slightly different, and it opens up potentials in live performance that are not there if you're just performing the live score over it, a score over and over again, or a fixed song over and over again. And I really love that dynamic quality. So I guess I see my part in like standing on, when I'm standing on stage or composing, as being the guy that brings to the fore the texture and the viscosity and the kind of mass and density and velocity of the sound, and transforms that in relationship to the kind of more fixed material that's coming out of the instruments on stage. I guess when you look at it with dancers and so on, it's kind of similar, but then rather than putting in sound, they're putting in energy. And so then it's transforming that energy into, a sonic representation of some kind. And then that's actually in some ways much more difficult, because when you think about, wanting to make, say, a 60-minute dance piece that's all interactive, then of course you have to ask questions about, well, how do those relationships develop over time, and how do you think about form, and what are higher orders of data that you might look at that help change the algorithms as the work goes on. And for me, these are really still very open, unresolved questions generally in terms of interactive work, and questions that interest me a lot, which is we've all seen pieces where basically the interaction is, I don't know, anywhere between 1 and 6 possible outcomes.
Right.
And we all know that kind of we're done with that in a couple of minutes.
Yep.
And so then when you think about, okay, I'm going to write this composition that's like 45, 60 minutes long with these dancers, and so you really have to think about how that whole system transforms itself across time. And of course, to do that, you have to have great collaborators. And I've had the great fortune of working with Company in Space and Helen Sky in Australia over many years. And she's like one of the first people to start putting sensors on her body and doing real-time stuff with it. And so she talks about this kind of cellular dramaturgy, this kind of beautiful notion of how the cells of the body become extended through the sensing, and how those things become conceptually one thing. And I guess that's the same when you get good at playing a musical instrument, the kind of instrument disappears. But yeah, so then you just need collaborators who are willing to spend time really both inquiring into that, rather than just like, let's make the piece and go and do it, and then who are prepared to really try stuff out over time and go on an adventure.
Sure, right. Well, Garth, unfortunately our time is already up. I scribbled down notes here. I had like another 10 questions I wanted to hit you up on, but it was really fascinating to kind of hear some of the philosophy of how you do what you do. I think sometimes people aren't super comfortable talking about it, and I feel like you seem to have like put a lot of thought into this already, and so it was really great to have you share it with us. I appreciate that, man.
Yeah, cool. It's been really delightful to talk with you, and I have to say you've drawn out those ideas. So yeah, I appreciate you asking such astute questions. It's really fantastic.
Well, thanks, man. So with that, we're going to let you go on and have the rest of your day. Thank you so much, and have a good one.
All right, and thanks for making this podcast. I listen to it and love it.
Oh, great. Thank you. All right.
All right, man. Bye.
Bye. Well, I am wrapping things up out here in Los Angeles. I just finished up with the Loop conference. If you were here and I didn't get a chance to meet up with you, I really apologize. Things got a lot busier for me than I expected. But in any case, it was great to see all the folks I did see out here. And I also want to thank Garth for doing this great interview. It was really interesting. We kind of dove in on some interesting ideas and concepts about doing performances and festivals and all that good stuff. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. I hope that if you have any questions, comments, or ideas, you'll drop me a line. It's ddg@cycling74 or darwin.gross@gmail.com. I got a lot of emails over the course of the week that I wasn't able to keep up with because I was on the road. I will be catching up with y'all. In the meantime, have a good one, and I'll catch you next time around. Bye.